You open your refrigerator door right now without thinking about it. Cold air spills out. Leftovers from 3 days ago are still safe to eat. You don't even register this as a miracle anymore, because it isn't one to you. It's just Tuesday. But for more than 99% of the time humans have existed on this planet, there was no door to open, no cold air, no safety net. And the real answer for how your ancestors solved that problem is far stranger and far more brilliant than you were ever taught in school. Here's the assumption most people carry around without examining it. They assume ancient humans simply ate what they killed or gathered, and when it ran out, they went hungry until the next hunt. Feast, then famine, on repeat. Simple, almost too simple. Because the truth is that early humans weren't just surviving meal to meal. They were solving a series of brutal, specific problems, each one forcing an invention that had never existed before, each one a small crisis your ancestors had no guarantee they could survive. To understand how this began, you have to picture the actual moment of crisis. A successful mammoth hunt could produce more meat than a small band could eat in weeks. That's not just good fortune, that's a countdown. Raw meat, left exposed to warm air and bacteria, starts breaking down within hours. So the problem your ancestors faced wasn't abstract. It was standing right in front of them, rotting in real time. Feast today, or find a way to make this feast outlive the day. That single problem is where the entire story of food preservation begins. The first crisis was climate. If you were living somewhere the ground stayed cold, you had an advantage, but you didn't know why, and you had to figure out how to use it before the meat spoiled. Archaeological evidence from Ice Age Europe suggests that early humans living in northern latitudes faced this exact puzzle and solved it by turning the landscape itself into a tool. They dug pits into permafrost. They wedged meat into rock crevices. They buried food beneath snow. Researchers studying sites in Siberia and northern Europe have found evidence consistent with this kind of deliberate caching, storage of surplus food in cold, stable locations away from camp. Nobody explained bacteria to them. Nobody needed to. They ran the experiment themselves, watched meat left by the fire fail and meat buried in snow survive, and drew the only conclusion that mattered. The ground could remember what the fire could not. But that solution had a fatal limitation, and it created the next crisis immediately. What happens when you don't live somewhere the ground freezes? What happens on the African savanna or in the humid river valleys of early Asia, where snow never falls and the earth never locks solid? Your ancestors in those regions faced the identical rotting meat countdown, with none of the advantages. They had to invent something from nothing. This is where fire, already used for warmth and cooking, got repurposed into something else entirely. Someone, somewhere noticed that meat held too long near smoke didn't spoil the way meat left in the open did. Smoking meat over a low, steady fire pulls moisture out of the flesh, and moisture is exactly what bacteria and mold need to survive. Take away the moisture and you take away their foothold. Archaeologists working at sites across Africa and Europe have found charred hearths surrounded by racks of animal bone consistent with drying and smoking practices dating back tens of thousands of years. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham, whose research at Harvard has focused extensively on the role of fire in human evolution, has argued that controlled fire didn't just change what your ancestors could eat. It changed how long they could survive the gap between one successful hunt and the next. Sun did the same job without needing a single spark. In coastal and riverside communities, this became the difference between eating and not eating during long-distance travel. Evidence from ancient fishing settlements shows fish laid out on racks, exposed to wind and sun, transformed within days into something dense, light, and stable enough to carry for weeks. That mattered enormously because it solved a crisis smoking couldn't. What do you eat when you're migrating, when there's no time to build a fire and tend it for hours, when every pound you carry has to justify itself? So if drying and smoking already worked, why did your ancestors keep inventing new methods at all? Because neither one solved every problem. Meat and fish dried well. Plants didn't. And drying demanded something not every environment offered reliably: consistent sun or steady fuel for fire. Somewhere, almost certainly by accident, a new crisis produced a stranger answer. food left sitting in liquid too long instead of simply rotting into something dangerous, sometimes turned into something safe, sour, and strangely edible. That accident became fermentation, one of the oldest technologies your species ever stumbled into without understanding a single thing about why it worked. Certain bacteria and yeasts break down sugars and produce acids or alcohol that make the environment hostile to the harmful microbes that cause spoilage. Your ancestors had, without knowing it, learned to recruit one invisible organism to fight off another. Archaeological residue analysis on ancient pottery, including work on Neolithic sites in China and the Near East, has found chemical signatures consistent with fermented foods and beverages dating back over 8,000 years, and many researchers suspect the real origin is considerably older, since fermentation needs no tools at all, just a container, some spoiled luck, and enough patience to wait and see what happened instead of throwing it away. Then came the crisis that pushed your ancestors further than any environment ever forced them to travel. What happens when meat needs to last for months, not days? Smoking and drying could buy weeks. Survival sometimes demanded more. The answer came from something most early humans could access even without forests, rivers, or the right climate: salt. Harvested from seawater evaporation, natural deposits, or mineral licks, salt did something none of the earlier methods could. It drew water out of food aggressively enough to starve bacteria almost completely, extending preservation from weeks into months, sometimes longer. This wasn't a minor improvement. It rewired what was possible. Salted meat and fish could travel further, last longer, and support populations moving into regions with no guarantee of a successful hunt waiting for them. The value of that solution ran so deep that entire trade routes and early economies eventually formed around access to salt. But its origin traces back to something far more desperate: a population staring down a season with no food and no room for error. Notice the pattern threading through all of this: cold, smoke, sun, fermentation, salt. 5 different environments, each one throwing a different version of the exact same threat at your ancestors, and 5 different populations, working independently, without contact, arriving at 5 different answers. That's not 5 isolated facts. That's the same crisis: rotting food and an uncertain future, forcing invention over and over again, anywhere humans existed on Earth. And here's what connects every one of those desperate ancient solutions directly to you, sitting wherever you're sitting right now. Every single one still exists in your kitchen today. Smoked salmon, sun-dried tomatoes, fermented yogurt, kimchi, sauerkraut, wine, cheese, bread, salted cured meats like prosciutto and bacon. Your refrigerator didn't replace these methods so much as it joined them. One more tool added to a survival toolkit. Your ancestors began foraging tens of thousands of years before electricity existed. When you reach for a jar of pickles or a block of cheddar, you're not doing something new. You're inheriting the answer to a crisis your ancestors faced and solved, one desperate improvisation at a time. There's something worth sitting with here, something that goes beyond the practical mechanics of drying racks and salt pits. Every method your ancestors developed demanded patience they couldn't necessarily afford. Fermentation can take weeks. Drying can take days of careful attention to weather and airflow. Smoking demands hours of tending a fire at exactly the right temperature. None of it offered the instant relief of opening a refrigerator door. Your ancestors were solving a problem that had no fast answer, trading effort now for survival later, understanding on some deep, practical level that outlasting the next season required work in this one. And maybe that's the real discovery underneath all of this history. Preserving food was never just about stopping decay. It was about your ancestors reaching forward into a future they couldn't see and placing something there for themselves to find. A strip of dried meat wasn't just dinner. It was a message sent forward through weeks or months, a promise that even when the hunt failed, even when the season turned harsh, there would be something waiting. So the next time you open that refrigerator door without a second thought, remember what's actually behind it. Not just compressors and cold air, but tens of thousands of years of crisis after crisis, each one solved by someone who had no guarantee it would work, and no choice but to try. You didn't inherit convenience. You inherited an answer your ancestors were forced to invent, one you now get to enjoy in an instant. Every single time you close that door and walk away, trusting the way they eventually learned to trust, that what's inside will still be good tomorrow.